everybody. Welcome back to the Skookum Report. Today's Bigfoot encounter story comes to me by way of Bobbie Short's friends and family, and it's her classic retelling of the Bauman story. I hope you guys enjoy this. It's a very well-written story. The presidential frontiersman and Rough Rider Teddy Roosevelt began writing his soon-to-be-published book in 1890, titled The Wilderness Hunter. The author writes of a grizzled, weather-beaten trapper by the name of Bauman, whose figure of a man reminded me of actor Robert Redford's portrayal of the legendary woodsman tracker Jeremiah Johnson. Bauman, however, was German-born and lived all of his life out on the early frontier. Roosevelt must have had some degree of belief in Bauman's tale to include it in his book. Before his legendary encounter, Roger Patterson wrote in his 1966 book, Do Abominable Snowmen of America Really Exist?, that Roosevelt was a hard man to fool with a wild tale. Bauman must have held to the story, for it was said that he could hardly repress a shudder at certain points in the yarn, a yarn that was to become a legend at Roosevelt's unwitting recounting, weathering the retelling for more than 100 years, and will go on to infinity. One of Idaho's best-known horror stories, it tells the story of two trappers who set out on a beaver hunt in the still remote alpine terrain of the beautiful Salmon River countryside. This portion of the Salmon River is located in the Bitterroot Mountains between the state of Idaho and Montana. To this day, stories of the Sasquatch come out of this part of the wilderness. Roosevelt wrote that the previous year a trapper's body had been found torn to bits and partially eaten by an unknown beast, which left enormous human footprints in its wake. Now, bears do not leave human footprints, and overlapping bear tracks can be differentiated. Oblivious to what should have been a warning to the senses, these two men journeyed deep into the wilderness's remote regions, moving campsites from one creek to another in search of satisfactory places in which to place their beaver traps. Here is that famous excerpt about Bauman from Roosevelt's book. Frontiersmen are not, as a rule, apt to be very superstitious. They lead lives too hard and practical and have too little imaginations in things spiritual and supernatural. I have heard but few ghost stories while living on the frontier, and those few were of a perfectly commonplace and conventional type. But I once listened to a goblin story which rather impressed me. A grizzled, weather-beaten old mountain hunter named Bauman, who was born and had lived his whole life out on the frontier, told me this story. He must have believed what he said, for he could hardly repress a shudder at certain points of the tale. But he was of German ancestry, and in childhood had doubtlessly been saturated with all kinds of ghosts and goblin lore, so that many fearsome superstitions were latent in his mind. Besides, he knew well the stories told by the Indian medicine men in their winter camps of the snow walkers and the specters, the formless evil beings that haunt the forest depths, that dog and waylay the lonely wanderer who after nightfall passes through the regions where they lurk. It may be that when overcome by the horror of the fate that befell his friend, and when oppressed by the awful dread of the unknown, he grew to attribute, both at the time and still more in remembrance, weird and elfin traits to what was merely some abnormally wicked and cunning wild beast. But whether this was so or not, no one man can say. When the event occurred, Bauman was still a young man, and was trapping with a partner among the mountains dividing the forks of the Salmon from the head of the Wisdom River. Not having had much luck, he and his partner determined to go up into a particularly wild and lonely pass-through which ran a small stream and said to contain many beavers. The pass had an evil reputation because the year before, a solitary hunter who had wandered into it was slain, seemingly by a wild beast, the half-eaten remains being afterwards found by some mining prospectors who had passed his camp only the night before. The memory of this event, however, weighed very lightly with the two trappers, who were as adventurous and hardy as others of their kind. They took their two lean mountain ponies to the foot of the pass, where they left them in an open beaver meadow, the rocky timber-clad ground being there onward not very practical for horses. They then struck out on foot through the vast, gloomy forest, and in about 4 hours reached a little open glade where they concluded to camp, as signs of game were plenty. There was still an hour or two of daylight, and after building a brush lean-to and throwing down and opening their packs, they started upstream. The country was very dense and hard to travel through, as there was much down timber, although here and there the somber woodland was broken by small glades of mountain grass. At dusk they again reached camp. The glade in which it was pitched was not many yards wide, the tall close-set pines and firs rising around it like a wall. On one side was a little stream, and beyond which rose the steep mountain slope, covered with the unbroken growth of evergreen forest. They were surprised to find that during their absence, something, apparently a bear, had visited camp and had rummaged around among their things, scattering the contents of their packs and in sheer wantonness destroying their lean-to. The footprints of the beast were quite plain, but at first they paid no particular heed to them, busying themselves with rebuilding the lean-to, laying out their beds, and building and lighting the fire. While Bauman was making supper ready, it being already dark, his companion began to examine the tracks more closely, and soon he took a brand from the fire to follow them up, where the intruder had walked along a game trail after leaving the camp. When the brand flickered out, he returned and took another, repeating his inspection of the footprints very closely. Coming back to the fire, he stood by it a minute or two, peering out into the darkness, and suddenly remarked, "Bauman, that bear has been walking on 2 legs." Bauman laughed at this, but his partner insisted that he was right, and upon again examining the tracks with a torch, they certainly did seem to be made by but 2 paws or feet. However, it was too dark to make sure. After discussing whether the footprints could possibly be those of a human being, and coming to the conclusion that they could not be, the 2 men rolled up in their blankets and went to sleep under the lean-to. At midnight, Bauman was awakened by some noise, and he sat up in his blankets. As he did so, his nostrils were struck by a strong wild beast odor, and he caught the loom of a great body in the darkness at the mouth of the lean-to. And grasping his rifle, he fired at the vague, threatening shadow, but he must have missed, for immediately afterwards he heard the smashing of the underwood as the thing, whatever it was, rushed off into the impenetrable blackness of the forest and the night. After this, the 2 men slept but little, sitting up by the rekindled fire, but they had heard nothing more. In the morning they started out to look at the few traps they had set the previous evening, and to put out new ones. By an unspoken agreement they kept together all day, and returned to camp towards the evening. On nearing it they saw, hardly to their astonishment, that the lean-to had again been torn down. The visitor of the preceding day had returned, and in wanton malice had tossed about their camp kit and bedding, in destroying the shanty. The ground was marked up by its tracks, and on leaving the camp it had gone along the soft earth by the brook. The footprints were as plain as if on snow, and after a careful scrutiny of the trail, it certainly did seem as if whatever the thing was, it had walked off on but 2 legs. The men, thoroughly uneasy, gathered a great heap of dead logs, and kept up a roaring fire throughout the night, one or the other sitting on guard most of the time. About midnight the thing came down through the forest opposite across the brook, and stayed there on the hillside for nearly an hour. They could hear the branches crackle as it moved about, and several times it uttered a harsh, grating, low-drawn moan, a very sinister sound. Yet it did not venture near the fire. In the morning, the 2 trappers, after discussing the strange events of the last 36 hours, decided that they would shoulder their packs and leave the valley that afternoon. They were more ready to do this because, in spite of seeing a good deal of game sign, they had caught very little fur. However, it was necessary first to go along the line of their traps and gather them, and this they started out to do. All the morning they kept together, picking up trap after trap, each one empty. On first leaving camp, they had the disagreeable sensation of being followed. In the dense spruce thickets, they occasionally heard a branch snap, and now and then there was slight rustling noises coming from the small pines off to one side of them. At noon, they were back within a couple miles of camp. In the high bright sunlight, their fears seemed absurd to the two armed men, accustomed as they were, through long years of lonely wandering in the wilderness, to face every kind of danger, from man, brute, or element. There were still 3 beaver traps to collect from a little pond in a wide ravine nearby. Bauman volunteered to gather these and bring them in, while his companion went ahead to camp and made ready the packs. On reaching the pond, Bauman found 3 beavers in the traps, one of which had been pulled loose and carried into a beaver house. He took several hours in securing and preparing the beaver, and when he started homewards, he marked, with some uneasiness, how low the sun was getting. As he hurried toward camp, under the tall trees, the silence and desolation of the forest weighed on him. His feet made no sound on the pine needles, and the slanting sun rays striking through among the straight trunks made a gray twilight in which objects at a distance glimmered indistinctly. There was nothing to break the gloomy stillness in which, when there was no breeze, always broods over these somber primeval forests. At last he came to the edge of the little glade where the camp lay and shouted as he approached it, but he got no answer. The campfire had gone out, although the thin blue smoke was still curling upwards. Near it laid packs wrapped and arranged. At first Bauman could see nobody, nor did he receive an answer to his call. Stepping forward, he again shouted, and as he did so, his eyes fell on the body of his friend, stretched beside the trunk of a great fallen spruce. Rushing toward it, the horrified trapper found that the body was still warm, but that the neck was broken, while there were 4 great fang marks in the throat. The footprints of the unknown beast creature, printed deep in the soft soil, told the whole story. The unfortunate man, having finished his packing, had sat down on the spruce log, with his face to the fire and his back to the dense woods, to wait for his companion. While thus waiting, his monstrous assailant, which must have been lurking in the woods, waiting for a chance to catch one of the adventurers unprepared, came silently up from behind, walking with long, noiseless steps and seemingly still on 2 legs. Evidently unheard, it reached the man and broke his neck by wrenching his head back with its forepaws, while it buried its teeth into his throat. He had not eaten the body, but apparently had romped and gamboled around it in an uncouth, ferocious glee, occasionally rolling over and over it, and had then fled back into the soundless depths of the woods. Bauman, utterly unnerved and believing that the creature with which he had to deal with was something either half-human or half-devil, some great goblin beast, he abandoned everything but his rifle and struck off at speed down the pass, not halting until he reached the beaver meadows where the hobbled ponies were still grazing. Mounting, he rode onwards through the night until beyond reach of pursuit. There is, by the way, a second passage in The Wilderness Hunter where Teddy Roosevelt may quite possibly have been describing a personal Bigfoot experience. He writes about how he and a friend were on a hunting trip in the state of Washington. They had contracted a Native American to guide them into a remote region. Their guide urged them to avoid a particular area due to some native superstition. That hunter-tracker Roosevelt had held that as utterly preposterous. In any event, old Rough Rider Roosevelt, as was his way sometimes, bullied the apprehensive guide into taking them to this area anyway. They did not find any big game during that trek or other sign, but Roosevelt made a point of mentioning the very strange noises he had heard at night while camping there. He did not recognize nor describe the noises, but he did give the distinct impression that they were unusual in his learned experience and found them to be very unsettling. Uncharacteristically, Roosevelt did not offer any explanation or speculation about the source of these noises. He simply mentioned them and then said no more about it. Odd for an author who otherwise went into such vivid detail relative to the animals he observed and hunted. While the killer creature was never given a clearly defined name, Bigfoot buffs believe firmly that this creature was a Sasquatch, but I could use some measure of convincing. Taken on its own, the Bauman story is not very impressive as evidence for the existence of wild men in North America, but when considered along with the more substantial reports, it acquires greater significance. Ultimately, readers of these eyewitness accounts will be left to judge for themselves the significance and value ostensibly placed on these stories in the future. Bobbie Short, 1995. Wow, that was an amazing retelling of that story. I loved it, and I loved the way she wrote it out and just made you feel like you were there. I want to thank her friends and family, Bobbie Short's friends and family, one more time. I really appreciate it and consider it an honor to be able to read her encounters and sightings and stories. If you or anyone you know has had a Bigfoot encounter or a sighting and you'd like to have it on the show, shoot me an email at skookumreport@gmail.com. That's skookumreport@gmail.com, and I'll be sure to get it up on the show for you, no problem at all. Don't forget to subscribe, hit that like button, and leave a comment and say hi. I enjoy talking with you guys, and I really appreciate y'all listening and coming to visit me at the Skookum Report. So I'll see you guys again real soon. Thanks so much, and God bless. Bye-bye.